Chapter 5. Money. Money! As Nancy reflected on her plan, another idea occurred to her. She was sure that Bess and George would love the chance to spend a vacation on a farm, since they had both mentioned it the other day. Nancy did some mental arithmetic and came to the conclusion that 3 steady boarders who paid their bills regularly might help to lessen the amount of the mortgage interest payments that threatened Redgate. And also keep Mrs. Byrd from selling the place, Nancy thought. I hope Dad agrees to my making the trip. That evening at dinner, Mr. Drew said, I'll be out of town for a week or so, Nancy. Do you think you can get some of your friends to stay with you? I have an even better idea, Nancy replied and smiled. She outlined her plan to help Joanne Byrd. Her father consented enthusiastically, proud as always of Nancy's desire to assist others. It was not so easy to convince Bess and George when Nancy telephoned them. They both wanted to help Joanne and agreed that a week or 2 in the country would be very pleasant, but there were complications. If George went, it meant she would lose out on a camping trip. Bess had planned to visit an aunt in Chicago, but admitted that the trip could be postponed. There's one thing about it, George said laughingly, as she finally agreed to give up the camping trip. I've never been with you yet that we didn't run into an adventure or mystery. Maybe a trip to Redgate will be exciting. Bess and George had no trouble in getting their parents' consent. It was decided that Nancy would pick up Joanne first, then come back for the cousins, since River Heights was on the way to Round Valley. Nancy packed her clothes that night after telephoning the plans to Joanne. As she was closing the suitcase, her eyes fell upon the copy of the coded message which lay on the dressing table. I'd better take it along and work on it whenever I have the chance, she decided. Nancy got up early the next morning and had breakfast with her father. After exchanging fond goodbyes with him and Hannah, she hurried to her car. It was close to 10 o'clock when Nancy reached Riverside Heights. She stopped at a downtown service station and had her convertible filled with gas and checked for oil. Then she drove to Joanne's boarding house. Her passenger was waiting. Nancy was glad to find that Joanne seemed to be in better spirits. It'll be such fun, all of us going together, Joanne said. And I know Graham will be happy to have you stay as long as you like. Only on the condition that we are paying guests, Nancy insisted. We'll see about that later, Joanne said, smiling. They put her suitcase into the trunk of the car and soon were on their way back to River Heights. Assured by Joanne that they would be welcome at Redgate, the cousins brought out their suitcases and put them in the luggage compartment. George took Nancy aside and said excitedly, A little while ago a man phoned here and asked for Miss Fane. When I answered, he said, Listen, miss, tell that snoopy friend of yours to stop her snooping, or she'll be sorry. Then he hung up without giving his name. Nancy set her jaw, then smiled. Whoever he is, he has a guilty conscience. So my suspicions were well founded. Who do you think he is? George asked. Either the strange man on the train who followed me here, or some accomplice of his. I'm glad for your sake we're going away, Nancy, stated George. Let's not say anything about this to Joe, Nancy advised, as she and George walked back to the car. It's a perfect day for our trip to the country, Joanne said excitedly. George could see by the expression on Joanne's face that a visit to Redgate Farm with her new friends was far more important to her than any other plans the girls might have had. I agree 100%, George answered happily as she stepped into the car. And I'll be glad to get out of this heat, Bess chimed in with a sigh. I spent practically the whole night dreaming about the cool, refreshing breezes in the country. As Nancy steered the convertible in the direction of Round Valley, she said with an eager smile. "We're off to rescue Redgate Farm." Nancy and her friends thoroughly enjoyed the scenic route to Round Valley. They stopped for a quick lunch and then continued their drive. The winding roads led through cool groves and skirted sparkling little lakes. Each hilltop brought a different and beautiful view. Gradually, the worried expression completely left Joanne's eyes, and color came into her thin face. She began to laugh heartily at the antics of Bess and George. As they rode along, she told the girls a great deal about her home. "You'll like Redgate, I'm sure," she said enthusiastically. "We haven't any riding horses, but there will be plenty of other things to do. We can explore the cave, for one thing." "Cave?" Bess questioned with interest. "How exciting! What kind is it? A home for bears or a pirate's den?" Joanne laughed. "There's a large cavern located on the farm. No one knows how it came to be there, but we think it must have been made a long time ago by an underground river." "You must have explored it before this," Nancy exclaimed. "Oh, yes, of course. Though I'll admit I never did very thoroughly, and I haven't been near the cave for years. As a child, I was always afraid of the place. It looked so dark and gloomy. Lately, I've been too busy working around the farm." "We'll have to put that at the top of our list," George declared. "I love spooky things." "Well, I'm not sure I do," Bess admitted. Nancy laughed. "We may even find hidden treasure in the walls." "I wish you could," Joanne sighed. "It certainly would come in handy." The hours passed quickly as the travelers alternately sang and chatted. "Why, it's almost 4 o'clock," George announced in surprise. "We've made good time," Nancy remarked. Bess spoke up plaintively. "I'm half starved. It's been ages since lunch. I could go for a gooey sundae." The others laughed, but agreed they were hungry too. "Let's watch for a roadside stand," Nancy proposed. "I'll have to stop soon for gas anyway." "We'll come to one soon," Joanne spoke up. "We're in Round Valley now." A few minutes later, she pointed out a combination filling station and lunchroom, which looked clean and inviting. Nancy turned the convertible into the driveway and parked out of the way of other drivers who might want to stop for gasoline. The group entered the lunchroom and took seats at one of the small white tables. They all decided on chocolate nut sundaes, topped with whipped cream. "Here goes another pound," Bess sighed as she gave her order. "But I'd rather be pleasantly plump than give up sundaes." Though there were few customers in the room, the woman in charge, who also did the serving, was extremely slow in filling the orders. Twice Nancy glanced at her watch. "If you'll excuse me," she said, "I'll step outside and get the gasoline. It will save us a little time in getting started. Don't wait for me if our sundaes come." She drove the car over to the pump and asked the attendant to fill the tank. Before he could do so, however, a large, high-powered sedan pulled up to the other pump, coming to an abrupt stop almost parallel to Nancy's car. "Gimme 5 and make it snappy," a voice called out impatiently. The attendant glanced inquiringly at Nancy Drew. "Do you mind?" he asked. "Wait on them first, if you'd like," she said graciously. Nancy observed the passengers with interest. There were 3 rather coarse-looking men, accompanied by a woman. Nancy could not see the face of the driver, for it was turned away from her. But suddenly he opened the door of his car. "I'm going inside and get a couple of bottles of ginger ale," she heard him grumble to his companions. As he stepped from the automobile and turned, Nancy saw his face. He was the mysterious man who had spoken to her that day on the train. In view of the telephone call George had received, Nancy did not wish to be observed. She turned her head quickly, leaned down, and pretended to be studying a road map. I hope he doesn't recognize me, Nancy thought, or see my license plate. To her relief, the man walked in front of the convertible without a sideward glance. At that moment, the woman alighted and walked toward the lunchroom, passing close to Nancy's car. She was tall and slender, with blonde hair that was almost shoulder length. Nancy's attention was suddenly arrested when she detected on the stranger a familiar scent: blue jade perfume. After the driver and the blonde woman had entered the lunchroom, Nancy gazed at the two men who remained in the automobile. They were the sort Carson Drew would describe as tough customers. The blonde woman soon reappeared and got back into the sedan. Then the driver came out carrying the cold drinks. Without looking in Nancy's direction, he addressed the attendant harshly. "Say, ain't you finished yet?" He turned to one of the men in the car and handed him the bottles of ginger ale. "Hold these, will you, Hank? I gotta pay this Byrd." Nancy started. "That man in room 305 called one of his friends Hank over the telephone," she said to herself. Could he be this person? Her attention was drawn back to the driver, who was paying the attendant. He took a thick roll of bills from his pocket, and with a careless gesture peeled off a $10 bill. "Aren't you afraid to carry such a wad around, sir?" the attendant questioned, gazing admiringly at the thick roll. The driver laughed boisterously. "Plenty more where this comes from, eh, Hank?" "You bet. My roll makes his look like a flat tire. Just feast your eyes on this." He flashed an even larger roll of bills in the amazed attendant's face. The filling station man shrugged. "I'll have to go inside to get your change." The moment he had disappeared, the third man in the car muttered to his companions, "You fools! Do you want to make him suspicious? Pipe down." He spoke in a low tone, but the wind carried his voice in Nancy's direction. "Maurice is right," the driver admitted. "The fellow is only a cornball, but we can't be too careful." The attendant returned with the change. The driver pocketed it and drove off without another word. Nancy instinctively noted the license number of the car. On impulse, she went to a phone booth and dialed her friend Chief McGinnis of the River Heights Police Department. "I'll ask him to let me know who owns the sedan and the foreign-make car that slowed down at George's house," she determined. "Then I'll find out about the driver, the woman wearing the blue jade, the men named Maurice and Hank, and maybe the man in room 305. End of chapter 5.